Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast.
Today's episode is a fascinating interview with Amy Gamber, a specialist in CMC crisis recovery, about how to break the death spiral, rescue failing CDMO relationships before it's too late. But before we dive into today's episode, we're pausing to mark a milestone. This is episode 200 of the PharmaSource podcast. Since launching this show, we've spoken with external manufacturing leaders from companies like AstraZeneca, Novartis, Johnson & Johnson, emerging biotechs, and the CDMOs who work with them. Those conversations have given us a unique insight into what's actually happening in outsourcing, beyond the press releases and LinkedIn posts. That's 200 conversations with people making decisions about external manufacturing, which, with the power of AI, we've now analysed to give us some interesting insight into what's actually happening. So I'm here with PharmaSource co-founder Luke Bilton to reflect on what we've learned from the last 200 episodes. So Luke, this is our 200th episode.
Yes.
What's happened here?
It's great. 90% of podcasts fizzle out after episode 3. So yeah, very happy to have made it to 200. I reckon that probably puts us in the top 5% of podcasts. So happy to be here. And if nothing else, I think it demonstrates a general life lesson that consistency, just showing up, matters more than talent.
How did it all begin?
Before we did anything else, before we launched the website or CDMO Live, the first thing we did was the podcast. Back in 2023, the thinking was that the pandemic had really shown the world that biopharma is this complex, fast-moving ecosystem. But from a media perspective, it's also a very highly regulated space. Lawyers need to sign off on every press release. But we wanted to dig below the surface in a way that was a bit less scripted and have meaningful conversations with all the smart, interesting people who are behind those press releases, and a chance for us to ask naive questions about how the world of external manufacturing really works.
So over these 200 episodes then, what's the most surprising insight that's emerged? Something maybe you didn't expect when you started?
The overall feeling I have from all of this is, and it's a pretty obvious point, I think, but what an amazing industry pharma is. And there's lots of challenges and frustrations, which are quite typical, I think, with big company politics and bureaucracy. But fundamentally, it's a space filled with fiercely intelligent, hardworking, collaborative people. We speak to lots of PhDs and MBAs, but people who genuinely want to make a difference to patients. When it comes to the challenges of getting new therapeutics to market, I didn't really appreciate the size of the mountain to get there for biotechs to secure funding to survive. That's one. I hadn't truly appreciated the impact of geopolitics, supply chain issues to cause such havoc with supply and demand. Most of the episodes we've recorded in 2025 seem to focus around how geo instability is redrawing global supply chains. That wasn't something we would have expected in 2023. And I'm particularly in awe of pioneers in areas like cell and gene, radiopharma, those advanced modalities which have to not just succeed in the science, but they're also trying to operationalize in a completely new way and find entire new processes which are financially viable. It's definitely not easy. So hats off to those who've taken that entrepreneurial path. And the same thing, of course, applies to the CDMO operators that support all of this amazing work. Modern manufacturing really does need an ecosystem to win. So a lot of the conversations we have are about how you can create those really strategic partnerships.
Yeah, it is interesting what you said. It has been really drilled home to me as well, the conversations I've had about uncertainty, the complexity in day-to-day operations. And if the wind changes, then all this kind of knock-on effect that really impacts how drugs get to patients. And also, taking a step back from that and remembering why we are all here to help patients. So you've spoken to external manufacturing leaders from big pharma to emerging biotech, a big range, obviously. When you look across all those conversations, what are the few things that keep coming up that pharma and biotech buyers actually want from CDMOs?
First thing, I think, is how different it is. The challenges which are faced by big pharma, managing a large amount of partnerships versus an emerging biotech who needs to establish one partnership to take them all the way through the pipeline. For large pharma companies, one of the trends at the moment is around the enormous pressure they're under to consolidate their networks. One of the interviews we had recently was with Sandoz, talking about reducing suppliers, or with Bayer and their Project Martini, which was about consolidating from 200 CMOs. It's quite a common thread, fewer and more strategic relationship. And in particular, the pressure at the moment around reshoring, driving us away from the era of globalized networks to region for region networks, Europe for Europe, US for US, Asia for Asia.
And so, how about for biotechs?
Well, their top concern is survival. When we ask them what the biggest challenge is, generally it's money. How do you align your CMC with those funding milestones? I'd also add that whether it's a biotech or pharma, one of the recurring themes is around cultural fit between the sponsor and the CDMO. Supposedly, it predicts about 50% of the success. Of all the different things you'd assess in an RFP, its cultural fit is one of the hardest things to do until it's too late.
Are there any other topics that are coming up?
Yeah, two big recurring themes we talk about a lot. Sustainability, in particular decarbonisation. We hear from all the top pharma leadership that sustainability is now table stakes with their suppliers. They all have net zero targets, and scope 3 emissions are such a high percentage, around about 85% of emissions. This can only be addressed through the supply chain. And the other is around AI and digitization, particularly around the integration between CDMO systems and that of the pharma companies. It's an area where the industry is really struggling at the moment. We've just published some research about this, which highlights that 92% of CDMOs report sponsors want those digital capabilities and are including that in their negotiations. But as of right now, none of the CDMOs we surveyed reported they've got full digital integration with their sponsors. So there's widening gap there. And one of the main bits of advice from the report is to fix that digital foundation first before getting into the fancy AI stuff. It's about trying to make the data as transparent with your partners as possible.
Absolutely. And it is really interesting having these sorts of conversations about AI and the environment. In, episode 500, I wonder the conversation around that will be very different, but it'll be really interesting to see. And so if people want to hear more, we will be sharing a deeper dive into more insights from these 200 episodes. So join us on the Thursday, the 11th of December, 2:00 CET for a webinar we're running with Sciential, Closing the Gap, what pharma buyers actually want from CDMOs in 2026. And back to the podcast.
On today's episode, we're talking to Amy Gamber, a biotech executive with over 20 years of CMC leadership experience, specialising in crisis recovery for late-stage biotech and cell and gene companies. Her track record includes restarting production after a manufacturing shutdown, salvaging failed tech transfers that were millions over budget, and rebuilding broken CDMO relationships while keeping critical programs on track. And I'm looking forward to a conversation about some practical ways that you can turn crisis situations around, and perhaps more importantly, how to prevent them in the first place. Amy, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, maybe to kick off with, you could give a bit of an introduction to you and how you came to specialize in this particular area.
Great. Yes. So I've got 20 years, as you said, in biotech experience. Started in the quality systems, which is great because it gave me a fundamentals in, what good looked like. And I was in commercial facilities such as for places like Amgen and Novartis. But I always found myself attracted to the place where things weren't working well. I was always the person that raised my hand to say, oh, that's not going well, or that's something new that we don't know how to do. Let me go see if I can figure it out. And as I went through, I started working more and more in different CMC operations areas and built kind of this body of knowledge. And ultimately, I wound up at a small cell therapy company, Atara, where I was fortunate enough to lead most of the CMC organization. But again, with a small company, as we know, there's often a lot of things that you're learning on the fly. We were a novel therapy, so it was the first time anyone had done an allogeneic cell therapy. So there was a lot of on-the-ground learning. And one of the things that I did with my operations background and having so many different experiences within CMC was I was able to go in and help with crisis management. So I got sent into a lot of places where things aren't going well. Can you go figure out how to restart it? Can you build some relationships, rebuild some trust, rebuild some credibility, and help get everything back on track? And ultimately, that led me to leading the manufacturing organization and end-to-end supply, where we had a number of CDMOs. We had 7 CDMOs, a 10-asset portfolio, and we were managing across 3 countries. So I got a lot of hands-on experience in how to manage different CDMO relationships.
Thank you. It'd be good to talk about a situation that many companies face, but few talk about openly, which is what it looks like when a tech transfer is in serious trouble. What are the impacts on cost, on timeline?
No, so when a tech transfer is going wrong, you're walking into a situation where you are literally, months behind schedule, millions of dollars over budget, $1 million or more, and you're struggling to even make a successful batch. And when you look at it from kind of a big picture, you're not talking about a technical problem. You have a business risk that you're trying to manage.
Hmm.
So I worked on, as an example, an early tech transfer. The engineering runs were not replicating what we had seen in development. They were just burning through time, material, and money, at least 6 months behind schedule. And the problem wasn't that the teams were incompetent. It was they were very capable, but we did not have a good tech transfer. So the development team had a lot of what we needed in their head, but they hadn't put it down on paper. And so the CDMO didn't understand what was critical and was not critical, and they were kind of working blind. And that I find to be kind of a common practice, or a problem, I should say, is that the knowledge transfer is incomplete. So that doesn't scale. The methods don't work the way you thought they were. And that for a small biotech can translate into just a huge delay in your next funding round because you can't get product made, you can't get it in the clinic, you can't get your data. And it's not, at that point, you're not talking about a technical exercise. It's really a business risk at that point.
How do you think companies need to better prepare tech transfer packages then? Is there a particular level of detail which you'd advise? I guess one of the issues, one of the blockers is about balancing completeness with IP protection. Do you run into that as well?
There are often concerns about that. I've run into people and it comes in a couple of different ways. There's we don't want to give them that information because, we don't want to give them all of our IP, all of our development history. But a good tech transfer package does not have to have your entire development history. There are things that you can hold that will not give that away, but you can still make them successful. So the way I like to think about it, and I actually talked to one of my teams about that, it's not enough to just hand them a stack of documents and say, here you go have fun, read this, couple 100-page document and figure out what's important, and then, go off and running. You really need to take that set of documents, and they should be fairly detailed. It should be process descriptions that tell you how to run the process. But I like to tell people it's sort of like you're walking through a new house, or, that's a good analogy. You got to show them the things. It's like, here's the things that go smoothly. Here are the things that don't, we often struggle with. This is what good looks like. This would be a warning flag. And that context takes it from being just a set of documents to helping them understand. And then the other part of that I always impress upon my teams was, not all process parameters are created equal. So stop treating them that way. You need to make sure you're calling out, these are the ones that are more critical to the process, and these are the ones that you have some flexibility. That way you're setting your CDMO up for success because they know these are the things that I need to focus on. And then the other thing that I always say is, there's a lot of pushback about wanting to send people on site. I am always do the people aspect of it because, the time that's spent with the PD, the people who actually developed your process, that's going to give that person-to-person transfer. And that's where you pick up sometimes those things that got missed in those documents because it's locked in their head and not on the paper. That's your opportunity to catch that and really have that back and forth dialogue. A lot of people don't like that because it's expensive. Oh, I don't want to spend the plane fare. I'm going to have to put somebody on a site for a week or two. Trust me, it is much less expensive to pay for that travel than to pay for 6 months of delayed tech transfer and failed batches and all the materials and everything that goes with that.
Do you have any advice or best practices for when someone's doing a site tour? What are those warning flags that people need to dig into a bit more?
Before the tech transfer or during the tech transfer? Because I have kind of two different sets.
Yeah, I was thinking more when you're at your sort of supplier selection evaluation type of stage. But yeah, let's break it down like that.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple things when you're at the supplier selection stage. So one of the things that I look for, and I always tell people, don't pick it on cost. I think for a small biotech where you're very cost conscious, there's a bias toward, spending the least amount of money possible. I always tell people, one, you should be getting multiple bids. And if you have one that is significantly less than everybody else, you need to understand why. Because in my experience, what often happens is you find maybe they don't understand your scope fully, and they don't understand all the pieces that are there. Maybe they don't, they've undercut, and they're going to they're going to go ahead and you're going to get a bunch of change orders once you get into it. So they've underbid the price, but they're going to be, oh, you want this? Oh, you want that? Things that you thought were included are going to wind up, that cost is going to add up. And then, or maybe it's just, they're just trying, to keep the cost down because they want the business, because they're worried about their own longevity, which is also a red flag. You want somebody that once you get in there, because you're going to be with them for a long time, is going to be relatively stable. So those to me are kind of red flags. I always want to look for somebody who has, is very experienced with your technical platform and is also got a long track record of successful tech transfers. So I think that's one of the flags that I would look for. I would also look for, how responsive are they? If you're sending over questions in the RFP phase and it takes a long time to get an answer, or you're not getting a straight answer, the RFP phase is the dating phase. That's when everybody's on their best behavior. And if you're having a hard time working with them in this phase, that sends a signal that you're probably going to have even more of a struggle once you sign on the dotted line and they've got you locked into a contract. So pay attention to those red flags.
We were talking before the call about when you worked on a plant which had been shut down and then got that restarted. It'd be great to learn a bit more about that. I mean, what that situation was and how did you go about doing that? Because that sounds like a big undertaking.
It was. When you've got a plant that hasn't been running for that amount of time, you've sort of crossed the line from being a technical problem to kind of a systematic problem. Something is sort of fundamentally broken. From what I did is, there was a lot of people that were like, you just need to fire everybody and start over, or, just go straight into technical, the process is broken. But I went ahead and I looked internally first. And I said, what do we not have internally that is preventing us from being successful? And I need to deal with that before I can go to my CDMO partner and say, you're not living up to your end of the bargain, because it is a two-way street. So I looked at a couple of things that I looked at, and, do the fundamentals exist? Do we have the policies and procedures for how we're supposed to be managing our partners? And I'm not talking like the 30,000 foot, high level document level, but actual practical guidance about what are the roles and responsibilities, who's making decisions, how are they escalated? Then we looked at the relationship and said, what's the relationship look like? Are people working together, or is everybody in CYA mode? And in this case, we were more at the latter. And what you would see is, instead of when batch failures were happening or we were having issues, instead of saying, let's work together to figure it out, everyone's like, well, we followed the procedure and we did what you said and it didn't work, so it must be your fault. At that point, you're no longer problem solving. Everyone's just getting there kind of, hovering. So you have to kind of start to set that relationship right.
Trying to work out what the CYA acronym means. Is that what it is? Cover your ass.
Yes.
As I'd say, yeah.
That's exactly what it is.
Right. So how do you deal with that situation then when the relationship has deteriorated to that level?
Yeah, it's really, it's a relationship. CDMO relationships are like any other relationship. It's usually breaks because of things like poor communication, loss of trust, mismatched sense of urgency. So the way I do it is I start by rebuilding, and you've got to think about everybody's perspective. The sponsor company is like, often if it's a small company, this is my only product, this is my lifeline. If something goes wrong, it's going to have the full focus of everybody from the CEO down. But from a CDMO perspective, you're one of like several clients. And yes, they're concerned, but they're not going to drop everything to manage your problem. So for me, it helps to start with that perspective of acknowledging and recognizing, I know I'm not the only program that you have. But trying to keep it from going out of what I call the death spiral, which is, one side's like, you don't care about us. The other side thinks these sponsors impossible. Now lawyer, you start copying everybody on emails, lawyers are getting involved, and you're only talking through formal channels. When you get to that point, what I like to do is I go in and talk to the leadership directly, and at that point you have to you may have governance set up, but it's kind of broken anyway. So you need to kind of go around the governance, go directly to, the people in the leadership and say, look, I understand that we are not working well together. Here's what we own. Here's what we think we can do to fix this. Help me understand what you need to make this successful. And then find the pieces where you can work together and you can start rebuilding. And from a sponsor's perspective, you need to be realistic about what you're asking. Asking for 24/7 dedicated coverage, doing nothing else without paying for that, that's not realistic. You're not going to get that.
Hmm.
But from a CDMO perspective, what I would ask as a customer is be clear and transparent in your communication. Help me understand where you are. If you don't have the data, say so, but tell me when I can expect it, and then follow up. Honor those commitments that you make so that I can start building trust in what you're telling me. That provides a really nice foundation for starting to rebuild that. And then it takes a lot of extra communication and at all levels. The other thing that I found that you often have to do when you get in that situation is both sides need to manage, their side of the house, meaning you have to break those patterns internally. So you have to make sure that your team is also, stopping the blame, is being the listening, is following through on the governance, and making sure everybody's behaving well, because it's amazing how easy it is for, one or two comments when you're trying to rebuild that trust to set everything back very quickly.
Yep.
It's much harder to rebuild. It's very easy to erode it back.
What would you say that a good governance framework looks like? Are there particular agenda items, key metrics, indicators? How would you do that in a way which is lightweight enough not to feel too onerous?
Yeah. So there's generally three levels, and you think about them, they should operate kind of like gears in a machine, and each one's feeding the next one. Obviously, you've got the lowest level would be your technical teams, and those are the people who are working together. They should be meeting roughly weekly. And they're going to go over kind of your daily execution things. So they're doing day-to-day execution, decision-making, technical items. The next level should be some sort of operations level. So that's kind of your mid-level, the people who are overseeing the direct work. And in that, you want to have the people who are empowered enough to make decisions and do problem solving and can kind of guide those working teams if need be. And you should be looking at things like schedule adherence, quality issues, production issues if you're in that space, and being able to make some decisions about how things are going. Those should be meeting weekly to biweekly. It kind of depends on where you are in the program and what phase you're in and what you're gearing up for. So it might be biweekly if you're early on, but if you're going late stage to commercial, you might be needing to meet weekly because you probably got a lot more things to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And then the highest level is your executive level, and that's like your joint steering committee. Sometimes people call it different things. That should be meeting on a quarterly, and that's your strategic look aheads. So that's where you're sharing, what's the strategy for this program? What's the regulatory? What's the business outlook? CDMOs should be bringing ideas about how can we enhance this program? Here are things that we can help work with you on. This is what we're seeing. So it's really kind of a trends and forecasting discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. What would you say the early warning signs are before you get into that death spiral to show that things are going south?
Yeah.
What should you be looking out for?
Yeah, if you've been through enough of these, the warning signs start to build up and you get that kind of spidey sense is what I call it. One of the things I look for is our timelines that don't make sense. So if I'm talking to people and I'm asking, walk me through your assumptions, and people can't explain like how they came up with a particular set of timelines, or if you ask two people and you get completely different stories, that's a problem. If you ask for a plan and they say, I'll get back to you, that's also a problem, particularly if you've asked a couple of times and you keep getting that answer over and over. So that's one red flag that I look for. Another one is glossing over issues. So you have a batch failure or something goes wrong, everyone chalks it up to operator error or something similar. We close it quickly, we move on, and then it happens again, kind of the same result, and then it happens a third time. At that point, you're losing months. You really don't understand what your problem is, and people aren't digging into it. So that becomes a red flag. That means that either there's something bigger issue that's not being addressed that's going to cost you time and money, or you're just not getting the quality system and the attention that you need to be able to resolve the problem. Another one that I look for, again, when that sort of situation, are people talking at each other or are they talking to each other? Talking at each other looks like, problem happens. It's not my responsibility that somebody else is to fix. Talking to each other or with each other is, let's figure out how we're going to solve it first, and then we'll figure out the contractual issues later. but let's fix the issue first.
Yep.
And then the other one that is a big red flag, and it took me a little while to pick up on this one, is leadership disengagement. So where are the executive team? Where's the site head? Where's the leadership? Are they showing up? Are they asking questions? If they're not, that's a signal that you are not a priority. This is not a priority. And that makes teams less likely to escalate when they have issues because you're not a priority. And that leads to things that start to fester, issues that don't get resolved, and then it kind of builds up over time. And then it becomes much harder because that starts that, like I said, that death spiral.
How do cultural issues play into that? I mean, particularly, I guess, when you're working with CDMOs in different continents, you might have different expectations. I mean, how do you try and navigate that?
Again, it really comes down to making sure that you have a clear set of expectations about, and sometimes you have to go back to the contract, although I will say I don't particularly want to, but I think the upfront communication about this is what I want, this is what I am looking for, this is what I expect at each stage of this process can help a lot of that. And then that's where your governance can help guide that. So because you can use those forums if people are not delivering, to kind of walk people back and say, this is what we said, this is what we agreed to, why are we not doing this? What's the issue? But yeah, you do often sometimes have expectations about what you think should be done, and culturally, maybe it's I solve everything first and then I tell you. So we've had to coach CDMOs, like, I don't want you to present to me like, here's all the issues that just happened and I've tied it all up in a bow and I'm just going to drop it in your lap. From a CDMO perspective, that probably feels really good because, look, I had a problem, I solved it for you. But you leave your sponsor partner in the position of now having to go to explain to their executive team that there was this huge issue that was going on that they had no idea about, and it could have completely derailed their program. And luckily it might be resolved, or maybe it's not. But executives don't like those kinds of surprises. Generally speaking, nobody wants to get surprised and find out that they were a week away from having complete disaster, but we saved it.
Yes.
We'd rather have the information up front, and sometimes it takes a lot of coaching to make people understand. I don't want you to wait until the very end and tell me at the last minute and hide things for it, because they're probably not deliberately hiding things, but that's what it can be interpreted as they're on the receiving end.
Sure. How do you bring contract enforcement into this when you're in crisis mode? I mean, a lot of what we've been talking about is about building trust and rapport and coaching and finding ways around it. But at what point do you sort of have a difficult conversation about, payment for non-performance, for example?
Yes. And that's one of the most delicate things that you have, because again, you're in a long-term relationship with the CDMO and you can't afford, to burn the bridge because you still need them. But at the same time, you can't ignore non-performance and just keep paying for it. So it becomes a very, very delicate balance of not poisoning the relationship, but getting what you need. And to be clear, I'd always rather pay for completed manufacturing. I'm not out to start a financial crisis with my CDMO. I know they need to have revenue coming in. But as a small company, it can be, a significant issue if I'm not getting what I need. So the way I like to start with that, and it's not always a one size fits all, but it starts with a conversation that looks like, I have been paying for X for Y months, and I am not getting my deliverables. And this is not a sustainable situation. I'm burning cash, I'm burning materials, and we're not progressing. So how are we going to address this? And that's where I start. And then I start asking again those diagnostic questions. What is preventing us from being successful? Is it a technical issue? Do we have an issue with the process? Is it a resource? Are we not communicating? And you move from, because there's a tendency when you get to that point, everybody's already up in arms, often gets very accusatory. People are ready to just pull out and, all the big guns and start, really just taking drastic action. But if you can stop it and have the conversation about, I'm not getting this, I need this, you are not delivering, help me solve it together, you can dial down the temperature a little bit, and then you can start working toward what is the solution. And what I found to be helpful is when you're having those conversations structured around, if I get this, I will pay Y. If I get this, I will pay Y. I'm working with a company now that just had that conversation that said they were negotiating back and forth. In this case, it was a little bit smaller of an issue. But what they agreed to ultimately is there was a report that was not in the contract that they wanted. And there were some other issues that had happened, and they were able to negotiate and said, if you give me this, then we will be happy to pay for that kind of thing. So don't, I would say for a sponsor company, don't hold on to payment till you get everything you want, because all that's going to do is just create this death spiral. Again, that's that death spiral of now lawyers are involved, nobody's talking to anybody, and it gets very difficult to resolve it. So find the points that you can negotiate on and you're willing to negotiate on, and then do what you can to try and come to a reasonable solution that protects your interests, but still acknowledges that work is ongoing on your program.
Yep. Thank you. One final question then. So for small biotech companies who may be outsourcing manufacturing for the first time and they want to avoid all of this, they want to avoid getting in trouble, top 3 things that they should do up front so that they don't end up in this situation?
So I would say, I already said the one first, but it bears repeating. Don't go for just the lowest price. Go for somebody who has the expertise from the technical standpoint, from the tech transfer, has the track record. Make sure you can get references. Obviously, they're only going to give you good ones. I've yet to have a CDMO who gives me like, here's my worst partner.
Yeah.
But still, if somebody's not willing to give you any references, that's a red flag. So if they're not willing to let you talk to anybody at all, I would question, why is that? And I will concede that some bigger CDMOs have CDA policy or policies about that, but you should at least ask. Another one that I tell people to do, and this is probably not on a lot of people's radar, but a place where a lot of companies get in trouble is ignoring the methods part of the tech transfer. Everybody gets really excited about the science, the process is cool, we're putting a new product in, and you forget about the analytical methods can often make or break a tech transfer, because usually there's many more of them. It takes a long time to transfer, and I do find that oftentimes the QC lab is where a lot of the backup is. So when you're selecting, don't just look at the technical aspects of the science and the process. Make sure you're inquiring about the analytical capabilities, what the lab looks like, how is it staffed, what's the package there that you're going to get, and you're going to get the support in that. If you can't test your stuff in process, you can't do release testing, you can't release batches, and you don't have a product. So make sure you're looking at that. The last thing I would say is making sure that you understand this process overall. I think a lot of people think we're smart, we've managed vendors, we'll figure it out. And yes, you can, but I've worked with a lot of people who have made kind of expensive mistakes doing that. So I would say, make sure you're working with somebody, hopefully in-house. If not, there's lots of people that can do it, that can ask the questions that you don't know to ask. Like, what's your philosophy on communicating bad news to client? Or what is your method transfer process? Or, talking about what is the tech transfer actually going to look like? What are the expectations? What are the requirements? That can help you avoid picking like a CDMO who can't deliver, or writing a contract that you find later has holes in it and you're not as protected as you thought you were, or they're working before governance is set up and nobody knows who's making decisions, and so people are just making decisions on their own without any oversight. And then I'm going to throw in a bonus fourth one is invest the time up front when it's still relatively cheap to fix, because there's always time and money to fix it later. That's one of those great axioms about manufacturing in general. And that can be like the face-to-face time in the tech transfers. Spend that time, spend that money to get people together so that they can talk about the process and they can go through it. Because the transfers that tend to go better are the ones where there's a relationship, there's understanding, and there's good communication. The ones that don't go as well are where it's more of a throw it over the wall, hope for the best, I'm not going to talk to you. That's where you wind up having to bring somebody in later to kind of fix what went wrong early on, and that gets a lot more expensive once you've got manufacturing in place.
Amy, great advice. Thanks so much for your time today. Fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much.